This is a production of O'Brien Communications.
Hi, I'm Tim O'Brien, and this is the Shaping Opinion podcast. Our guest today is Mark Joseph. He's litigation director at a group in Canada called the Democracy Fund. It's widely considered the leading voice in the battle for free speech in Canada. I wanted to talk to Mark about a specific bill under consideration in Canada. The bill would enable the spread of censorship, and it would threaten free speech in that country. It's called the Online Harms Bill. Mark Joseph, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Mark, I looked at your bio before we got started today, and it's an interesting bio for me because I do a lot of talk about communication and speech. You're an attorney. You're actually the head of litigation for the Democracy Fund. What's a typical day like for you? You probably cover a wide range of things and not just the area that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, well, Canada's an interesting landscape for free speech, especially now with our second consecutive Liberal government. And our jurisprudence is different than the United States jurisprudence. So as someone who's at an organization that protects civil liberties, we are constantly, engaged in these sort of guerrilla warfare skirmishes against the state that tries to, sanction the speech of Canadians through various methods. So we're constantly scanning the media landscape. People reach out to us, and we try and help where we can.
As litigation director, what's a typical day? Do you spend much time in court, or do you spend most of your time going through data, documents, cases, case files?
I guess a little bit of both. I'm not strictly, a trial lawyer, but we're often, I found myself dealing with crowns for criminal prosecutions arising from the Freedom Convoy. A lot of those people were charged with mischief, obstruct police, a breach of court order, from what we say amounts to peaceful speech or peaceful assembly. So there is dealing with the Crown. We've had trials on those issues. Other times it's dealing with professional regulators for speeches by teachers or nurses who spoke out against, say, COVID mandates. Privacy, sort of integrity investigations from people in the sort of municipal councils who misspoke or said something offensive allegedly, and they're being investigated by the integrity commissioner for harassment policies. So it's all over the place.
The Freedom Convoy you mentioned, I followed that in real time when that was happening. I found that to be a super interesting case, and for me as an American, it really illustrated for me the differences between America and Canada on speech issues. So for those who aren't familiar with the Freedom Convoy, could you tell them basically what it was about and what your role was in defending the people who were involved there?
Sure. So it originally started as a protest by the truckers. A lot of them, when they tried to cross the U.S.-Canadian border after the implementation of or Quarantine Act restrictions, they found that they couldn't actually conduct their business, their cross-border trucking business. So a lot of them, their families were suffering economically. So they decided to physically bring their trucks to Ottawa and engaged in peaceful assembly. Now that grew rapidly, as you probably saw, so that the core of downtown Ottawa was overwhelmed with these trucks who were parked, outside of Parliament. That's, I guess, the equivalent of the White House. And that became a serious problem for the government at the time, Liberals. And the Liberals eventually chose to crack down and physically remove these protesters that obviously grew into the tens of thousands and spread worldwide. And the protesters were charged, a lot of them, with mischief. So mischief to property, just blocking the sidewalks of the streets, mischief to persons, blocking access to people to walk around, obstruct police if they wouldn't leave, or breach a court order because the court had told them to get out. So then once they were charged, we stepped in and had to defend them against these charges. In some cases, the Crown's like their prosecutor, obviously. The Crown was looking for years in jail for what we say was peaceful protest.
What was the main issue they were protesting?
It was the mandates. Eventually, like I said, it was the trucking issue, the cross-border trucking, but then it grew into the mandates because it was because of the mandates, the COVID restrictions, that they couldn't conduct their business.
And it was basically putting truckers, independent truckers, out of business.
That's right.
For doing that. And so what they did was they used their trucks to protest. And as you said, they were charged with mischief because trucks are big things. And when they block traffic, they didn't get them necessarily on the speech. They got them on that. But you obviously defended them. And it was a free speech issue because it wasn't, there were times I did see in the coverage, there were ways that the truckers were trying to allow people to get around them, to get through. It wasn't a total blockade, but they were definitely disrupting the capital city when they were doing that, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, that's the argument the Crown made. Now, it was pretty clear that the truckers kept the emergency lanes open because truckers, they have a certain code they live by, and they didn't want to run into problems with, causing a dangerous situation to people downtown. So they tried to do that. Now, they were honking their horns, so there was an argument that they were creating noise pollution as well as diesel fumes, but really it came down to the mischief aspect that they were blocking access to the core streets, etc. So that's where the Crown sort of resiled to.
How did you do in representing your clients in the convoy?
Well, I would say that TDF, we represented 30 or 40 individuals, multiply charged. We managed to resolve them at the conditional discharge level. So for us, it goes absolute discharge, conditional discharge, suspended sentence, and then I believe a CSO. So it's a guilty plea without an admission of a criminal conviction. But most people, our review of the jurisprudence indicates that most people that went to trial didn't do well. So they were convicted of mischief. And there's a big trial involving Tamara Leach. I don't know if you've heard of her.
She was one of the leaders.
Alleged leaders, yes. And they charged her with some serious offenses, counseling mischief, counseling intimidation, a couple others. And the only thing I believe that she was convicted on was mischief. Technically, it was another charge, but it collapsed into a mischief. So now she's going to be sentenced next week. And the Crown is, I think, looking for some serious punishment. But again, it's a mischief charge. This is a relatively low-level criminal charge. So again, my point is, if you went to trial, the Crown usually got their conviction. So I would say that TDF did pretty well.
When I looked at that, and I see the contrast, because you can understand if you read the laws on the books, mischief and trucks, and the difference between what might be a peaceful protest and a disruptive protest that causes other people, I would say, infringes on their rights, their rights to go about their lives. When we see that in the United States, because of the First Amendment, and I don't just say because of it, because there is such a thing as a peaceful protest and a non-peaceful protest. And it seems like authorities in the United States, for the most part, are high. That's a high bar for a peaceful protest, because you see destruction, you see roads blockaded quite frequently when these protests happen. You don't have emergency vehicles having access to those same roads. Highways, these are not just side streets. These are major highways they're blockaded by protesters. And you have the risk of the safety for the protesters themselves. And yet, a lot of times, the police will just sort of let the protesters do their thing and not interfere, even though according to the convoy standard, that would clearly be mischief at the very least, and maybe something worse, wouldn't you think?
Well, I mean, we tried to defend our people by holding the Crown to their onus. So just because you're in a crowd doesn't mean you agree with everything the crowd does, right? The Crown has to prove each element of the offense. So look, every protest involves disruption, including labor protests, right? So we were concerned that the Crown, the prosecutor, was taking an overbroad approach. They were overcharging and they were seeking severe punishments here. And even if you can see that the protests went too far, looking to put a first-time offender in jail for years over a mischief charge is just way overboard. And I recognize there are differences between the U.S. and Canadian system, but the underlying principles are similar, that there's got to be parity here between defendants and proportionality in the application of the law. And again, these people were protesting COVID mandates, which we now know, I mean, one could argue were absurd and not properly founded in law. So, I guess the question is, what else were they supposed to do? They were choked off from their livelihoods. They couldn't see their friends and family. They were locked in their houses. And the Canadian government, just approved this all. So, of course, they were going to protest. And how far could they go? I guess that's an open question.
And in typical Canadian fashion, they did it in the snow. It was some pretty cold weather. I wondered how they were getting by. Obviously, truckers are pretty resourceful when it comes to that, and I found that part of the story pretty interesting as well. That says a lot, really, right there. A little bit about what I wanted to talk to you about today, and that was some of the differences between the U.S. and the Canadian system for free speech. But more specifically, the article that I read about you recently, where you were quoted, was an article about a bill, not a law, a bill in Canada that is called the Online Harms Bill. And I always find these titles funny because they always, bills oftentimes try to frame themselves as doing the opposite thing of what they might actually be doing. I've learned that, and I'm not necessarily saying that's the case here, but there's a very Orwellian nature to a lot of these bills, online harms bill. So I guess it's to prevent online harm. How would you describe the bill?
Well, the bill died on the order paper, as we say in Canada. When the government falls in Parliament, has to be reconstituted after a new vote, that all the bills are sort of expunged. So that bill faced a lot of backlash, but fortunately it died in the order paper. So now the government, we hear, is proposing to take a fresh look, they've said, which means they're either going to modify it and introduce it or reintroduce it whole. And the problem is the bill does three things. It amends the Canadian Human Rights Act. So that's our, I guess that's the civil right. You have the Civil Rights Act, and it empowers people. I know there's criticism in the States for that civil rights law, that it's been over-applied. Well, we have something similar, I guess. It's the Canadian Human Rights Act. So it amends that to reintroduce hate speech provisions. So for private companies, so the government can move against private companies for publishing hate speech. It also creates a notice and takedown regime for online speech deemed to constitute one of 7 types of harm. There are 7 types of harm are pretty broadly construed. We can talk about that. And then it amends the criminal code to add some pretty severe penalties for a standalone offense motivated by hatred. So there has to be a predicate offense, and then if it's motivated by hatred, they can tack on severe penalties, including life in prison. So it's, I would say, a poorly drafted and overbroad bill, and their government's proposing to take another look at it. So we expect that they're going to push to reintroduce it.
It seems to me, when I read about it, that the bill is not only one of those things that encourages censorship, but it almost requires censorship on the part of online platforms. And they have to be the judge and jury of what is hate speech and what isn't, or they have to pass a test and answer to the government after that. So you have the Online Harms Bill, and in order to comply with that, if I'm a big tech platform, a social media platform, I have to sort of have my own committee that understands that law, and we have to moderate content. That's the word, moderate, but it's actually censor content to comply with that act, or at least to keep ourselves out of trouble with that act. And there was one case, I think, where at least the old version of the act, when something was flagged, that they had 24 hours to take it down. So it wasn't, this is let's raise some red flags about certain content. No, you have to be the judge and jury. You have to raise concerns about this content, and you have 24 hours to censor it. And if you don't censor it, then there are penalties for you. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, that's essentially what it does. So it sets up a Digital Safety Commission, a Digital Safety Office, and anyone in Canada can can flag content and send the report to the commission, and then the commission, or at least both the commission and the online service provider, are notified that this is potentially harmful, and the consequences to the service provider of not taking that down can be pretty severe. I think it's like a percentage of their gross worldwide revenue. So I've been in-house counsel before. People respond to incentives. I'm not going to risk as in-house counsel keeping allegedly harmful content up and risking having an investigation and possible punishment that involves hundreds of millions, tens of millions of dollars of fines against my company. I'm just not going to take the risk. I'm going to take it down, and then let the party who feels aggrieved appeal through various levels, up to the tribunal level.
What laws already exist on the books in Canada that govern speech? I know that there are some, and I know that for the reason that you even exist to do the work that you do, there are certain laws that already exist to govern speech. Why would they even need an online harms bill if they already have these other laws?
Look, we say, TDF, when we studied this bill, we say that all of the 7 potential harms covered by the bill are already covered under existing laws, and we've set that out in our online harms brief that your listeners can find online. As to why the government needs further laws, governments expand just by virtue of being governments, I guess. But I think the government says, well, there's some gaps here with respect to child protection. Maybe, in which case, okay, amend the criminal code with respect to child protection. They don't seem to need these extra laws. We have criminal incitement to hatred under Section 319, incitement to genocide. Criminal hate speech is covered. That has to be pretty severe, and in some cases, you need to get permission from the Attorney General to bring those charges. So we have a different system. We have a charter. Section 2B of the charter protects freedom of speech, but then in typical Canadian fashion, we set out exceptions to the rule because we wanted to be nice, I guess. Whereas in the U.S., you've got a Ohio and Brandenburg standard and your First Amendment, which is pretty rock solid, right? The court really has to struggle if they want to override. They want to, accept certain speech from this protection. It's got to be severe. It's fire in a crowded theater that actually results in potential harm. The pitchfork outside of someone's residence, where it's likely that the speech will incite actual burning down the residence. You got to make a pretty clear nexus there. In Canada, we don't have that, so it's a little more expansive. But still, there's a case to be. The Crown has to prove case that there's actual incitement here. There's some pretty terroristic, dehumanizing speech, but really, there's definitional problems with that as well.
It's actually just an observation on my part over the years. In America, we have the First Amendment, and it does give us freedom of speech. And I wanted to mention something address something that you just said about that. But over the years, just as I've seen Canadian media, and I've seen media from the UK, and I always found it funny that even the humor crossed lines that the American humor didn't at that time in those years. And I always had this opinion that speech was more free in places like Canada and the UK. I felt this way for years until the last few years. And only then did I realize really how strict, if not the culture, the law could be on speech in places like Canada. And to your point, you talk about the Brandenburg case, and I actually had a conversation with a lawyer who worked on the Supreme Court case in the U.S., and it was about a group called, they were Asian members of the group, and they called themselves the Slants. and I forget who brought the case, but basically that somebody brought the case that they couldn't use that name because I think it was it was patent and trademark. They couldn't patent that name because it was deemed hate speech by the Patent and Trademark Office. So the lawyer who worked on the case, his name's Ron Coleman. I talked to him at length about it for this podcast, and the bottom line is that the Supreme Court said in that case, and in many other cases, it may be hate speech, but that doesn't make hate speech illegal. So it may be offensive speech, it may be speech you don't like, but it doesn't make it illegal. And that goes to that high bar they talk about with speech. And the solution, and this is a cliche saying in the United States, but the solution for speech you don't like is more speech. And especially when it's not so much a trademark or a symbol or something like that, but when it's actual free expression of views and opinions, or maybe of data and information that you think is correct. So we go back to COVID, and you have people that say, well, yeah, I don't think that mandate is correct. I want to speak out against it in Canada or in America. I don't think that requirement to stand 3 feet apart or wear a mask. I think that's you had doctors in the United States that were saying that doesn't really help, and then they faced consequences on that. They were censored. So you have so many situations like that, and then as I mentioned and you mentioned, hate speech. So could you get into a little bit more detail in Canada about how speech is actually criminalized? And to the extent that you can compare it to the United States where it's not criminalized.
Sure. So I'll speak to the Canadian experience first. So we have criminal hate speech provisions, and the definition of hate speech arises out of a case called Keystra, where it's considered to be vilification and detestation, I think. Now, no one really knows. You've got a Socratic problem here because no one really knows the essence of that definition. So we just tend to substitute words there. We describe words with other words. So vilification and detestation, something dehumanizing, comparing people to insects, asking them to defend their existence as humans, that sort of thing. But the court recognizes that it's a subjective test, and so they reconcile to this view that, okay, well, hate speech is something that causes other people to possibly discriminate against the group. So they kind of shifted away from the essence of hatred to, okay, what's going to cause people to treat this group badly? But that has a whole host of problems because there's sort of what's the standard. It is a reasonable apprehension of harm here. Do you need experts to establish that this will lead to discrimination later? I think of these shifting justifications for speech restrictions. I remember in the 80s, Dungeons and Dragons causes people to worship the devil, and then they said, okay, well, heavy metal music is actually satanic, and then it was rap music causes people to kill police. And then it was pornography causes people to commit sexual assault. And now it's hate speech causes people to commit violent acts. So this is sort of media effects argument keeps occurring. But then when you press people on, well, how do you define this type of speech? And then how do you prove that it causes the harm you say it causes? No one's been able to solve that. And then so in Canada, we have similar problems, but that's the way we've defined it. I would note that earlier in the 90s, the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court said, okay, it's vilification, detestation, and calumny. And as long as the courts or tribunals refer to that standard, no problem. And then lo and behold, the Keystra case comes out and they said, okay, wait a second. Yeah, we're going to get rid of calumny now. So we said, fine, it was a stable definition, but now it's not. We're going to amend the definition to, well, how do you know that the present definition isn't going to change because the last one changed, right? So you can see the problem here. In the States, you've got the Brandenburg definition, which I think is a lot more stable. You can prove that there's incitement to violence, and there's a likelihood that the incitement is going to result in violence, right? So you can say violent things. You can even say things that might be inciting, but you got to show that there's likelihood that that's going to result in violence. So that's more measurable. And for a lawyer, when something's more measurable, it's you can provide more evidence toward it. So
there has to be cause and effect to that point that you just made. In other words, you can't just say we need to rise up. If someone's giving a speech in the town square, they have to say we need to rise up. You need to go to that building over there. You need to find the man on the 4th floor and you need to hurt him. If he says that, yes, that's a violation. But if he doesn't say that, if the speaker says we need to rise up and that company over there in the corner is our enemy, if that's all the speaker says, that's not enough. At least it doesn't meet the standard established by our Supreme Court. Now, who decides in Canada? Who decides what's hate speech? Regardless of the definition, is there a committee or a group that decides, or is it always before a judge?
Well, if it's criminal hate speech under Section 319, I think it's 318 in our criminal code, it would go before a judge. But if it's, we have various, well, if the Human Rights Code is amended with this new bill, it would be tribunal members, and they don't even have to be lawyers, I don't think. So it's a matter of administrative law. I know in the United States, you guys have pushed back a little on the growth of these administrative tribunals to decide serious issues that would otherwise go before the court. Well, in Canada, we have a similar problem. It goes before these tribunals. And then if you want to get it to a court, you've got to have what's called a judicial review, which means you got to convince a court that the tribunal decision was unreasonable. Usually, it can be from a range of reasonable decisions, but as long as it's not unreasonable or incorrect, if it's a charter challenge, you're out of luck. You can't even get a court or a judge to review that. So that's what would happen if this bill passed. You get the Section 13 amendment, and then people would be sued for uttering hate speech, by a prosecutor under the tribunal, right? So you'd be stuck at the tribunal, the administrative law level, essentially.
Mark, in your experience working with all the clients that you've worked with over the years on this, what is the most, I'll use the word bizarre, this is not a legal term, but what is the most bizarre case that you saw brought that you couldn't believe was even brought against a person because of their speech?
Well, there was a case, I think it's Ward in Quebec, and that case, a Quebec comedian made a really tasteless joke about a disabled child in a nightclub, and I believe that went all the way to the Supreme Court. So that's like going to your U.S. Supreme Court over a joke, because under the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, the tribunal said that this decided that this was hate speech. And I can't remember the actual expression, but it was a pretty distasteful joke. But the tribunal held that constituted actionable harm, and it had to go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, it didn't in this case, but it didn't strike down the law. And in fact, it made a comment that vilification and detestation isn't the only sort of categories of potential hate speech here. There could be others. And I think they mentioned that if you cause a person to argue for their basic humanity, if you deny their basic humanity, you cause them to argue for their basic humanity, that could constitute hate speech. Now, again, you've got a definitional problem here, right? No one has been able to define what that is. So as lawyers, we're struggling for certainty here so we can advise our clients. And if there's no certainty, we can't advise our clients, and people can't comport themselves in compliance with the law if they don't know the law. It's just, but one might say this isn't a bug. It's a feature of the law, because then the government can always say, well, if you say that, or in saying that, that's a potential problem, and we're going to take you to trial or a tribunal. So you better not. Just don't risk it. And anyone with sense of survival, corporate or individual, is just not going to risk it. We're risk-averse people, at least in Canada. I know in the U.S. you're maybe more litigious, but in Canada we tend to be risk-averse.
My guest last week was David McGarry, and we talked about the European Digital Services Act. And one of the things we talked about last week kind of crosses over into what you just talked about here, and that is this whole issue of whether or not speech is as horrific as it might be. Is it something that crosses a line in a legal sense? And what I mean by that is, and I'll give you the same anecdote that I ran by David, and that is all of us who are very pro free speech people who will defend the right of someone to say something that we really find distasteful, as you just said. So someone might say to you, well, yeah, don't you think whatever that person said is wrong? And that's their criteria. The average person will look at that and say, well, that person never should have made that joke. They should pay the price. That person never should have said what they said. They should pay the price. And if the government is going to arrest them, so be it. They're the ones that said it. They should pay the price. That's the knee-jerk reaction people have when you talk about these things. But when you start to talk about things that matter to them, and you mentioned unions, so it's very feasible that a government could decide at some point that you can't say certain things that are very pro-union because it's a violation of somebody's rights, other rights. Or you can't say certain things about health, or you can't say certain things about groups or people, or even yourself. Like I mentioned in the case of the Asian rock band, they couldn't even name themselves a derogatory name in a sarcastic sense because an outside party said, yeah, that could be perceived as hate speech, even though we know you don't hate yourself. So it really gets back to that question. How do you answer it, Mark, whenever someone says to you, well, don't you really care about those people? Don't you think that, doesn't that bother you, whatever they said? And isn't that enough?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think everyone, such as ourselves, have to have a reasonable response to that. But I mean, I would invoke, J.S. Mill, which is why defend awful wrong speech. And it's in part because you want knowledge. So you want people to have a justification for holding the positions that they hold. And you can't do that unless people actually are confronted with the wrong view. They need to work through it, and we need to have arguments against these wrong positions so that we can justify why we're holding the right positions. It's like giving people the right answers all the time. You wouldn't teach your children by giving them the right answers all the time. You want, when they learn math, they're going to have to struggle through the problems first themselves so that they have knowledge. Well, it's the same with moral knowledge or political knowledge. It's more difficult because there's ostensibly no right answers to a lot of that stuff. But so when you're confronted by awful, terrible speech, and the government just gives you the answer, they just go around hammering people and censoring. Well, the citizenry doesn't actually have any knowledge as to why those positions are bad. You're creating robots, basically. And the other thing I would say is that if you surrender your ability to make these judgments yourself as a free citizen to the government, you're in peril, serious peril, because the government is going to eventually use that against you. And we know this throughout history. Christopher Hitchens, famously said, censorship is making a rod for your own back, and it will be used against you. David Goldberg, I think it's the head of the old ACLU, when the Nazis marched to Skokie, Illinois, the ACLU stood up for the right of these horrible people to speak in horrible ways, march through a Jewish community, spouting their horrible anti-Semitism, and the justification he gave was essentially that if you give the government this power, it's going to be used against you. And the bylaw that the city council, I think, invoked to prevent that, he pointed out that it's written broadly enough that it was going to prevent the Jewish war veterans from marching as well. It happens over and over and over. The government doesn't care who they're using the law against. They will use it against anyone they feel is a threat to their power. I mean, this is the foundation of the U.S. system, is to set it up so that the government can't use their power unjustifiably against individuals. The individual is supreme in that system, and they have redress against the government's abuses.
I keep hearing the word as you speak, representative government, in my mind, and the reason I hear that is because representative government, which is what we both have in Canada and the U.S., we have elected people who go to the Capitol to represent us, and in order to come to some sort of conclusion on laws and issues and policies, there has to be debate. That's assumed. That's just assumed in representative government. There's going to be more than one point of view, and until an issue is resolved, you have to have debate. And in order to have debate, you have to have free public speech. And in order for those elected representatives to hear from their constituents, those constituents have to be able to express their own points of view. And that's where I think the House of Cards starts to fall down on the people that want to propose censorship. Because if they really adhere to this system of democratic principles, representative government, there has to be an allowance for speech. And that's where we get in then to words like misinformation and disinformation that the government wants to protect. So quotes around that word, protect citizens from other points of view. And that I think is that slippery slope we keep talking about here is like, well, okay, who decides what it is? What's the definition for misinformation? And maybe the more fundamental question, why do we need to protect people from misinformation? Can't they protect themselves from that through their own means? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I mean, we've seen this. This is a term that I personally find terrifying. We've seen the introduction of this term. Europeans, they use it in their law, and they're really going after that type of thing. And in Canada, we just had a study put out by StatsCan about the rise of, what do they say? They investigated misinformation. So, and they cutely defined misinformation as information that is verifiably false or inaccurate, which is a circular definition, right? I mean, it didn't make the premise of the study didn't make any sense. Nonetheless, they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to say misinformation is bad. But this is a concept that is infuriating to me because again, if you're allowing the government to determine for you what you can read and say and what is true and false, I mean, you might as well put yourself in intellectual chains. It's absurd. They in order for the government to do that, they'd have to set up a procedure that allows them to infallibly determine what's true and false, right? I've never seen that system ever. And there's a deeper sort of philosophical problem, which is what counts as truth? Like, do you have a theory of knowledge that allows you to claim we have absolute certainty under this epistemological system that there's such a thing as truth or falsity? Now, this is a problem. This has been a problem from, since Socratic times up through the sort of the empiricism, realist epistemology, and then that was overthrown by sort of, you would say, postmodernist philosophy. But this is a live issue at a deep philosophical level, and the government's just going to come in and pretend that it's not, right? And I've challenged the EU commissioner on this, and they had no answer. Anyone I challenge on, they just have no answer. How are you going to set up a system that allows you to determine what's true or false? And can you even philosophically claim that you've got a theory of knowledge that allows you to say this is true and this is false? No one has answers to these questions because they're unanswerable. That's the human condition. We have to struggle with that. And that's the beauty, I think, of the American system, is it puts the onus on the individuals to determine for themselves the answers to those questions and to write, rousingly and beautifully about it. But to give that all to the government and just say, we're just going to let them decide for us is just is terrifying and comically dangerous, I would say.
It is, and I find it ironic, at least, to say when the government does want to take that role, when people want to delegate that to the government, because to your point, I mean, there could come a day when the government comes back to you and they want to censor you. In my business, my day job, I'm a public relations person. I've been in public relations for years, and I can remember being involved in so many different projects where you had at least two points of view on an issue, and they were very sensitive issues sometimes. And it chills me actually to think that in those times there was never a question of whether we could speak our minds on the issue, or that the public could speak their minds on the issue. It was always assumed that everybody could say what they wanted to say and they wouldn't be censored. But nowadays, and it is very much because of so much communication is digital and it can be regulated, it seems like that's what it is regulated. And so you couldn't stop a person from standing on the street corner and saying what they wanted to say. But now if that same person uses the platform X and they say that same point of view, pressure can be brought to bear on X to censor that comment, and it can be tracked. And algorithms can do keyword searches, and they can find that person and either censor the comment or maybe ban the person altogether from the platform. Do you see the whole digital wrinkle to this as being sort of the game changer as to why there are these new movements for things like the online harms bill and other things that are not necessarily digital specific? Do you see the internet as being this sort of big breakthrough for people who want to censor others?
Well, look, I think what's happening in the information space is similar to what's happening in other spaces with the introduction of the internet. It's disintermediation, right? So our elites or the power centers have lost control of the informational space. So the narrative that they used to espouse and be assured that that narrative was going to replicate and not be challenged is gone. So the little people can now speak up. And of course, the powers that be don't like that, because the thing that powerful people fear most is losing power. And that's the same for, Representative Democrats and kings. It's the same thing. Politicians fear losing power. So we saw that with the Twitter files, I think, where it was exposed that the government was putting heavy pressure, I would say coercive pressure, on the platform, social media platforms, to censor or else. Now, I think there was a recent U.S. Supreme Court decision that just went to standing. I think one of the attorney generals had sued, right, and the Supreme Court just said that, okay, we're not going to look at the substance of this, but you don't have standing because you didn't suffer harm. But I think individual plaintiffs or litigants, when they get to the Supreme Court, they would be able to mount an effective argument, I would hope, that here's evidence that the government was pressuring social media platforms to censor my speech about COVID or, whatever. And that's a censorship issue. That's an infringement of my, my First Amendment rights. And I would hope that they would succeed there, because there was a lot of evidence in the Twitter files that that's exactly what the government was doing. Now, it doesn't matter if, the government can't say that, well, we didn't do it directly. We just threatened the social media platforms to do it themselves. So we had nothing. I mean, that's not gonna fly, I don't think. If it does fly, we're in a lot of trouble. But that's what I think is happening. That the powerful people lost control of the narrative, and now they're trying to do through the back door what they can't do through the front door.
Well, that's true. The argument in that case, it was the United States. I think it was a bunch of attorneys general, but the case was spearheaded by Missouri, and I guess it was an issue of standing, but I remember the argument in that case was that the people that were defending the government were saying, hey, the government has an FDA, the government has all these various, divisions, the Health and Human Services, and they have a right to have their own public relations departments, contact the media, and lobby for their point of view. It's their free speech. They have a right to free speech to tell the platforms what they think, and it's up to the platforms to decide what they're going to censor. That was sort of the argument. But as you say, and as everybody with some common sense can see when they say that, is, well, wait a second. If the federal government is they're not only having a meeting with you, social media platform, but they're giving you a list of people they want banned. and they're giving you a list of posts they want taken down, and they're doing it on a turnkey basis. They're doing this on a regular basis, where on a Sunday night, if you worked for X, the old Twitter platform, you were getting an email or a message or a text from somebody in the White House basically saying, get this guy off of Twitter. We don't want him on there. And so they had a grocery list of people that they had to ban and censor on almost daily basis, according to those Twitter files, of who had to be done. And it was directly coming from the government. But as you said, the Supreme Court sort of sidestepped that issue, and they made it one of standing on the Supreme Court case, so they didn't bring the case on that basis. Then there's the issues of disinformation. You mentioned something about the government that I wanted to ask you about. When you look at the internet, you can't say that 100% of everything you see online is true. You just can't say that. Everyone knows that. That's unrealistic. That's like counting the grains of sand on a beach. And yet, somehow proponents of censorship have come up with this standard that things have to be truthful. So they have to pick and choose what issues, what topics, what subjects where things have to be truthful, and they sort of ignore the rest. What have you seen there in terms of consistency, or what issues would you say are the ones that censors like to ignore and censors like to pay more attention to? Are there any particular issues that fall into those two categories?
Well, I think it's nowadays you see a lot of the speech problems, or at least you see the pro censorship groups pointing to speech that they, in their political or moral philosophy, think is blasphemous. It could be to do with gender or sexuality, or equality, diversity, inclusion, that sort of thing. And I think for a while, conservatives or civil libertarians kind of were on the back foot with respect to that. They felt under attack, and it's it certainly became a problem for them. But for me, it's just, I see these arguments all the time, and if you've lived for a couple decades, they're just warmed over arguments, right? It's just, this is my sacred cow, and I think that it should be, speech against it should be censored. I mean, I have a particular problem with the term Islamophobia, because it conflates anti-Muslim bigotry with blasphemy, and religions are just one idea like any others, and they should be open for criticism. Christians and Jews and Hindus have had to endure criticism of their religious beliefs, and we all accept that. And but now there's been a rise of some Muslims who want to put criticism of their religion outside the bounds of acceptability. So again, we've seen this before. It's the same failed argument that's just been warmed over, and it's just with more outrage or different outrage, right? And we're supposed to be outraged, and then we're supposed to agree to the censorship. But that's, I think, something we should resist.
There's this one article that I read, and he's not a justice minister now in Canada, but he was a justice minister and attorney general. His name is Arif Virani. You may know him. And he described the online harms bill as a tool for safeguarding the public. And I just asked you, basically, does the government really care? Or what's their motivation? Do they really care about safeguarding the public if they know they can't do it 100% of the time, and they pick and choose certain issues on which to care about and which ones they don't? So what he says is, and I'm going to quote him, and I'm going to read this to you and ask you for a reaction. He says, if there's a genuine fear of an escalation, in other words, damages and misinformation, then an individual, and also censorship, if there's a genuine fear of an escalation, then an individual or group could come forward and seek a peace bond against them, and to prevent them from doing certain things. Now, that's one part of what he said, and here's where I found it pretty interesting. According to Virani, he said that if you have these measures like the online harms bill, you could keep people away from places like synagogues or mosques. In other words, if you don't police speech, you allow intimidation to occur. You allow an environment of hostility to occur. So you have to police speech, or you're going to have this environment that keeps other people away from their mosques or synagogues. That's where he was going. And then he said, if you don't censor people, basically, I'm paraphrasing everything. He said you could contribute to de-radicalizing individuals exposed to harmful ideas who online later might commit violent acts. I mean, so there is a sleight of hand in communications there that people may not pick up on, so I'm going to point it out. A lot of times people will take an issue and they'll talk about what could happen, not what did happen or what will happen. They'll say, well, this could happen, therefore we need this law. This might happen. I can imagine something happening, therefore we need a concrete law to prevent what I can imagine. So they're dealing with a realm of imagination, and they're using their own imaginations to justify the enactment of concrete laws or policies, which they aren't related, because I can imagine the sky being pink, and that doesn't mean it's going to be pink. That doesn't mean we need a law to say the sky can't be pink. So, that's an extreme example. So when you look at what this person said in Canada, basically, he's trying to justify the Online Harms Act by saying what could happen. And he's also trying to justify it by saying we need to protect people by censoring other people preemptively, because they might say something that could affect you, not because they did say something. That just seems to me to be really out there in terms of the abstract nature and the abstract justification. And in a sane world, I can't see people going with that, but we don't live necessarily in a sane world. What do you see with that case? When someone makes a case like that to you, does it have any legs in the legislative system, or is that something that's easily shot down?
Well, I think he was referencing some criticism addressed at a part of the bill that was like an anticipatory speech crime. So there was proposed amendments to the criminal code that said if a person believes has a reasonable belief on reasonable grounds that there was going to be a hate speech incident, they could apply ahead of time to the court to seek what's called a peace bond here. So the peace bond arose from sort of intimate partner violence situations where the husband was abusive and the wife, to protect herself and her family, had to get a peace bond to keep him away from the family. Okay, well, there's a reasonable anticipation of harm. He's abusive. He's up on charges, be convicted of domestic violence, and the courts would step in anticipation of possible violence. Now, what the minister was responding to was people like myself at TDF saying, well, wait a second, you're applying that to potential speech infractions. I mean, this is overbroad, and the peace bond had things like you had to wear, the monitor, the ankle bracelet. You couldn't go on the internet. You had to stay in your house, submit to drug tests, and that just because a crown or a prosecutor said, well, we think that this guy is going to utter some hate speech in future. You didn't actually have to utter hate speech and get convicted prior to that. There was some fear that you were going to, and then the prosecutor could bring this application for a peace bond, and arguably he or she would get it. And so that was a pre-crime. It's just like Minority Report. It was essentially a pre-crime on the flimsiest of bases. But you can see what happens when you tamper with these speech laws. The government would say, well, this is rare, which is the trust me bro argument that we see. You know what I mean? Well, it's never going to happen. Well, then why is it in the amendment? Then just get rid of it. It's never going to happen. It's the same thing with the amendments to the criminal code that we're going to give life imprisonment for hate speech, hate motivated crime. It's the same response he gave. Well, it's going to be rare and a judge would never do that. And it's, again, trust me, bro, it's just not. Take it out then. Take it out of the amendment. But that's where the criticism was coming. But again, it goes to your definitional problems of hate speech. They're just overbroad and they're not stable enough, linguistically stable enough. And so all of these there's a cascade of problems that just come from this. But again, the government doesn't care, right? It's all they see is an expansion of their power to hammer their political opponents, because every application or charge is going to be politically motivated. Who gets charged for these hate speeches and who doesn't? We just had Israel-Palestine protests. You probably have them on your campus as well. But people are looking, wait a second, who gets charged and who doesn't get charged, right? My political opponent, we want to see him get charged, right? But my political, allies shouldn't get charged. And there's no good response to that. And so that brings the administration of justice into disrepute, because people of the law and then the adjudication of the charges, right? You can't have absolute parity. So now people are going to say you're just politically favoring, your people you like, punishing, people that I like. And there's no good response to that by the government.
I just have one more question for you, because we're now talking about this online harms bill, which is a bill. What do you think its chances are of passing at this point? And is there a form that you could anticipate it actually passing, or do you think it's going to fall apart and not get passed at all?
You're asking me to speculate about a political process, and I'm terrible at doing that. But in Canada, we have a parliamentary system, so the present government has a slight majority, and that's all they need to pass the law. And it has to go through, it has to be introduced, and it has to go through various committees. We have a Senate, which is unlike your Senate. It doesn't have a whole lot of power, but it does have to go through various systems of criticism. So we're hoping that it will get criticized. If the bill is just introduced wholly, if it's the minister suggested that maybe we'll split it. So the criminal stuff with respect to child protection, that'll go separately. And as I said, to the extent that there's gaps in the criminal law about child protection, okay, fine, you can pass those. But he's saying the speech stuff, the speech heavy part of the bill will go separately. And so that hopefully will face more scrutiny. But it's not like the U.S. system where compromise is difficult in the U.S. system, and you really got to make sure that you have the support at various levels of your government in order to get a bill passed, which I think is a pretty good system, because then the real crazy ideas don't get passed. It's only the stuff that we all agree on that gets passed. In Canada, it's different. The crazy stuff can get passed, theoretically.
Well, that's probably a good way to end it. And I don't think Canada certainly doesn't have a monopoly on crazy when it comes to legislative support. We have our share in the United States. So, Mark Joseph, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
The Shaping Opinion podcast is a production of O'Brien Communications. Copyright O'Brien Communications 2025. Find us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like to watch, go to YouTube, Rumble, or our Substack page, shapingopinion.com.